I am familiar with Bayesian analysis. For the most part, I tend to look at Bayes' window whenever I'm evaluating some papers.
So you like color?
I mean, I do working drafts and check for similarity scores, and whether it's AI similarity or whether it's it's direct text, wiki text. Then I have two different Bayes windows that I use. One of them is a 20%. That's for the AI similarity check, and it's 30 for simple unoriginal context. So I've used it there, but in the context of the kind of work that I've done in document analysis, I haven't really thrown myself into that just yet. I have not exactly had the resources.
Best kinds, right?
Yeah. Thank you for your concern.
But I did manage to design some thresholds within their thresholds of shells of the degree of attachment to or opposition to one of the three independent variables that I started with. I now have 7 independent variables, partly thanks to discussions that I've had with Ian Gray here, and among others.
All right. Okay, so with that, we've still got 2 people coming in from the chat, but we will go ahead and get started. Please, everybody, help yourself to our refreshments, courtesy of the Career Center. We have support for our ongoing Rooted in STEM series. So this is our public speaker series for the UNT Dallas STEM Center. And we are very proud to have our final speaker for 2024, which will finish off our first year of this program. And it is Professor Jonathon York from Dallas College. Jonathon York holds a Master of Arts in Politics from the University of Dallas in Irving from 1999, and began teaching government and political science at Mountain View campus in Dallas College in 2005. He has previously taught at Northlake, Brookhaven, Tarrant County College, all over. You going to what, 4 different campuses this week?
Yes, I'll be at 4 different campuses, well, including this one.
Including this one. He is a member of the American Political Science Association since 2001. He is an affiliated APSA Indigenous Studies Network member and has contributed to the seminal work Honoring the Circle, which is an exhaustive scholarly work on Indigenous political thought published by Westside Books. His
Waterside.
Waterside
Yes,
books.
Waterside.
There we go. His primary research interests include political theory, ideology, foundations of political thought, and indigenous politics of the Americas. Previously, he is Mountain View's faculty champion for Vision and Excellence program for 9 years. He has maintained an active presence at Mountain View campus as political information officer for the Faculty Association, member of the Faculty Advisory Committee for Dallas College Learning Commons, and has been a participant and co-advisor for student organizations from political science to astrophysics, and is an amateur musician and astronomer. And on a personal note, he is a wonderful dear friend and a former mentor. So when we talk about like mentors and faculty, these are the relationships that help shape people's entire careers, as Jonathon York has helped shape mine. So with that introduction, thank you so much. The board is yours.
Guess I need to get up here. I feel flattered. There was one thing I forgot to let you know about. I've also recently joined, just in the last 6 months or so, the Association for Political Theory. It is a new organization that is that's running parallel to the American Political Science Association. How I managed to get in there, how they managed to let me in, I don't think I will ever know. Because according to their charter, you have to have a PhD in hand to be a member. They waived that in my case. I still don't know why. So here we are. I think it may have. I know that a lot of people will ask, okay, what's a politics guy doing here with a STEM program? Well, part of it is, yes, I am Mountain View campus's resident telescope pilot. And I also have found that when looking at political phenomena, especially the kind of political phenomena that I study rhetoric, semantics, diction, the kind of text that you see in political artifacts, whether it's a speech or an advertisement or a book, a treatise. My background is actually in political theory and philosophy. However, I found that when conducting a document analysis along the lines of sort of a marriage of qualitative and quantitative reasoning, I found that there are certain insights that can be gained. And in fact, I think that's what my next slide is, about the idea of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics concepts. They apply to fields not typically associated with science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And one of the things that we're going to see with one of my examples is how we can think of American politics and constitutionalism as an engineering problem. It is fundamentally an engineering problem. So one can gain valuable insights from applying STEM concepts elsewhere. And I have 3 examples that I'd like to share with you today. There is the Enlightenment in American Constitutionalism. So we'll be looking at the little bit of that historical context. There's also 20th century American political science. 20th century American political science, particularly after the Second World War, was dominated by a specific way of thinking, a specific methodological tradition known as behavioralism. For the record, I am not a behavioralist. However, I am not afraid of formalizing informal models. One of the courses that I actually teach is an Introduction to Political Science course. And just last week, I informed my students that if you are more comfortable with formal models, make sure that you can communicate it. And informal modeling is how you can communicate with the general public. If you are used to informal modeling, then finding the rigors of logic and mathematics to formalize that model will help ground you in empirical research. So the last example that I want to share with you is a personal example. And it's kind of what educated me into realizing that, yes, we need both. We need really a synthesis of both the principles we see in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, as well as the more broadly theoretical and philosophical tradition. This also goes to show that I am not a student of Charles Merriam. Anyway, we'll start with the Enlightenment. And it often comes as a surprise to particularly to my classes, that when thinking about modern political thought, that it is actually rooted in the scientific revolution. I could have gone all the way back to Giordano Bruno. I also could have gone back to Niccolo Machiavelli, who emphasized what is rather than what we wish could be. In that sense, he's something of an empiricist. Actually, so is Aristotle. So there is a continuity here. The continuity with the Enlightenment, with Enlightenment thinking that I'd like to share with you today, though, is if you have ever read the Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, which is Isaac Newton's magnum opus. It translates from the Latin to Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. What we think of as STEM and philosophy were not the different animals that we tend to think of them today. So in the Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, Newton has an entire chapter devoted to what he calls the system of the world. And his system of the world is grounded in two pillars of what we see with STEM principles. These two pillars are that the universe is both reasonable and observable. So there's a rational component and an empirical component. This got snatched up by John Locke. And for people who are accustomed to political theory are doubtless familiar with John Locke. The STEM side, people know Isaac Newton. On the humanities side, they tend to think back to John Locke. But I don't know if you know this or not. John Locke was Isaac Newton's college roommate for about 9 months or so, until Isaac Newton finally kicked him out of the apartment there at Cambridge. Why? Because he found his notes on the essay concerning human understanding and said, "You've been going through my stuff, haven't you?" So yeah, even though Locke was turned out on his ear, he nevertheless called himself a dedicated Newtonian. Newton and Locke inform the American founders as well. There's also, of course, Gottfried Leibniz's vis viva principle that is connected to certain principles we see in John Locke's second treatise of civil government, as well as Isaac Newton's system of the world, but it doesn't really get formalized. Those of you who are really into the mathematical constructs, who really want to see that formalization, you're probably more familiar with Émilie du Châtelet. Anybody here know Émilie du Châtelet? You do, wonderful, I'm so glad. She gets so little attention, it seems, but she was the first person to formalize in a compact way Isaac Newton's system of the world, specifically the law of conservation, specifically the total energy conservation law. That comes, the nomenclature we get for that comes from Émilie du Châtelet's translation of Newton's work. And she's considered the founder of French science. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on, since after that diversion into French science, the mother of French science, Émilie du Châtelet, there's also Thomas Jefferson. A lot of people tend to knock Thomas Jefferson for a lot of his social issues. So some of the more difficult realities of his life, having been a Virginia slaveholder. And there are those who would impeach his argument in the Declaration of Independence about natural rights. But it turns out that the natural rights argument is often misunderstood. In fact, the concept of rights generally is often misunderstood, misconstrued. When we look at Thomas Jefferson, not only was he a political theorist, not only was he this Virginia slaveholder, not only was he a delegate to the Second Continental Congress representing the Commonwealth of Virginia, he was also a scientist, an inventor, a horticulturalist, and obviously a statesman. People tend to look at the Declaration of Independence through a Lockean lens. And when they do, they don't realize that Jefferson himself is more completely Newtonian even than John Locke himself. This is to really snap the Declaration into focus. If we think of this as a direct application of Newton's system of the world, being both rational and empirical, then it is rendered comprehensible. And the entire project of American constitutionalism can also snap into focus. It turns out it's analogous to the principles of thermodynamics. Now, of course, we're familiar with 4 laws of thermodynamics, or 4 principles of thermodynamics. The 0th law, however, was not really discovered until 1925. So we'll have to leave that one alone for now. It's what allows superconductivity. The other three were already floating around in Newton's day, in Chatelet's day, in Jefferson's day. So if we take a look at those three principles of thermodynamics: conservation, entropy, and equilibrium. The first claim, or the first principle, is that matter and energy can be neither created nor destroyed. They can only be transformed. If you're familiar with Einstein's general relativity equation, the mass energy equivalence function, you'll see that it's simply an extension of this same principle. Energy and mass have an equivalence, right? And since matter and energy can neither be created nor destroyed, they can only be transformed. Think of that mass energy equivalence function. Okay, the second part, though, is entropy. Entropy was explored by Leibniz. It was explored by Chatelet. It was explored to some degree by Newton as well. Jefferson definitely looked at entropy when he was conducting weather observations as vice president of the United States. Adams was sick, wouldn't let him into the White House, and so he took off over the Naval Observatory in the Capital District and didn't have much else to do, so he busied himself with some of the foundational research that leads to the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration and the National Weather Service. Entropy. There's a tendency towards disorder, right? No mass energy transfer is 100% efficient according to this principle. So if I were to rub my hands, here I am rubbing my hands, what's happening? What's happening here? What's that? Generating heat. Why?
Because of the friction.
It's the energy of friction. What else is happening? There's energy of motion, right? There's energy of friction. There's also, if the longer I do this, the longer I rub my hands on this, over this table, what's going to happen? You're going to, not just heat transfer, you're also going to see the energy of erosion, right? I am scraping skin cells off my hands, right? Now it's going to get hot. Is there any way to make this more efficient? Are you sure? People say, no, there's no way to make it more efficient. What if I lubricate my hands? Now I can get them moving faster, right? Yeah. This actually is going to come back and haunt us. Sorry about the water on the floor. It's just water, thank goodness. The problem, of course, is eventually if you have a closed mass energy system, entropy always increases. I decided to do everybody a favor and put the generalized equations up there too. In closed mass energy systems, entropy always increases. Why? Because no mass energy transfer can ever be 100% efficient, right? Some energy, some mass is going to be lost in either an unexpected or an unplanned or an undesired secondary transformation.
You can hear it. That's one of them.
That's one of them. You can hear it. Absolutely. You can hear it. You can feel it. I can feel it. And yeah, my hands are starting to get rubbed raw. But it helped a little bit when I put the water on. I could have used something else, some other kind of lubricant, and also some kind of coolant. The water performs both functions. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Let's take a look at politics. This is coming from the American founding, the mind of the American founders, the framers of the US Constitution, especially James Madison. Now, I haven't mentioned Madison until now, but he was sort of the wunderkind at the Constitutional Convention 11 years after the Declaration of Independence. If we think of rights, as energy, that means that rights can be neither created nor destroyed. They're potential political energy. The pursuit of happiness is the exercise of those rights. That's kinetic political energy. Under this worldview that we see from the American founding, this idea of government is a mechanism. It's a machine to transform political energy from potential to kinetic. The degree to which that is accomplished, the level of efficiency of that energy transfer from potential political energy, rights, to kinetic political energy, we are living our lives, free and pursuing our happiness. That's justice. That has a special name in matters of law, and it's justice. And the implication here is that if the laws of nature are universal, as we read in the system of the world, the laws of politics also obey these same laws of nature. Let's go on to the next one. Yeah, this power train that I had there shows that we're talking about building a machine. Thus government becomes an engineering problem. Here's the consequences. Political conservation. Rights can be neither created nor destroyed. That's the natural rights argument. Nobody can give you rights. Nobody can take them away, in spite of what the Texas Constitution tries to tell you. They didn't participate in the natural rights argument. In fact, they even went so far as to invoke some older form of social contract theory, which Jefferson doesn't. Locke does, Jefferson doesn't. Madison doesn't. Political entropy. No, this is the tragedy of looking at politics this way. No government can guarantee the exercise of rights for everyone. Perfect justice, sadly, is impossible. You're never going to get perfect efficiency of transfer from potential political energy to kinetic. So you have to build in some way of adding that water, adding that coolant, adding that lubricant. Guess what? That's what the courts are for. Political equilibrium. All governments eventually fail. Active participation can extend the mean time before failure. The illustrations that I have up here, one of them deals with the index of refraction. If you think of rights as white light passing through a prism, when you think of civil rights, civil liberties, those are the other colors from the diffraction, from the index of refraction that produces the spectrum, spreads out the wavelengths. That's how we can look at civil rights, civil liberties. They can be explained in terms of that original natural right of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. But active participation will extend the mean time before failure, right? So let's go ahead and move on. Madison adds this. How many of you remember, I think it's like the second grade, and I think it's in February, Fire Prevention and Awareness Week. Anybody remember that? The fire department comes in and all the kids get the little red fire hats, little red plastic fire hats. Remember that? And you had to fill out the little workbook and then connect the dots and you see the fire and you're trying, maybe you're coloring in using a crossword or something like that. Well, one of the images from that Fire Prevention and Awareness Week workbook is this. It's called the combustion triangle. Combustion. That's rapid oxidation, right? Mm-hmm. What do you need to start a fire? Fuel, heat, and air, right? Fuel, heat, and air. You need oxygen, you need fuel, you need a source of heat. James Madison in Federalist 10 writes about how he actually states that liberty is to faction as air is to fire. Faction is like fire. Faction is dangerous. So is fire. But what's that? That's a controlled electrical fire, right? That's what a data projector is. That's what a computer is. That's what these lights are. Granted, okay, that's photoelectric effect as well. But you get the idea. If you can engineer a structure to harness the potential destructive power of fire, why can't you do that with the potential destructive power of faction? Liberty is to faction as air is to fire. Well, if that's the case, then Madison is inviting us to think of this again as an engineering problem, right? What is the fuel? What is the heat? And it takes a little bit of doing, but we figure out that heat is our interest. People are the fuel, and our liberty is the air. So we have these metaphors, motivations, and institutions we see in. Ever wonder why there's this regular distribution of power into three distinct departments: legislative, executive, and judicial? Because it fits this. It also goes all the way back to the classical political thinker Xenophon, who said that there are only three things that ever motivate human action. Three, only three. Everything that you can possibly think of and that is a motivator for human action boils down to either fear, desire, or hope. Consequently, the work of human hands and minds boils down to toys, tools, and weapons. The problem, of course, is, well, ignorance. Xenophon pointed out that fear, desire, and hope coupled with ignorance invariably produces tyranny. Why? Because the fire has gone out of control. The fire has gotten away from you. So what do we see? We see the crucible of desire with the legislative power. It's an expression of will. It's seen as the power of the purse, the legislative power. It's an expression of desire, and it's a tempering of interest. The people themselves, we have this visible, kind of a tangible sense of the people involved in government. The executive branch is not just whoever's sitting in the White House. It's actually 93% of the entire machine is executive branch, whether it's a cabinet department or a regulatory commission or an executive agency. These are all 93% of the employment in the federal government is executive in one form or another. The judiciary is related to the scale, the judicial power, and so it's also our placement of hope, just as the executive is a manager of fear. That lubrication, that cooling mechanism, whenever there is a complaint, whenever there's a dispute, whenever the heat of faction or the fires of faction start to get out of control, you can always petition this other venue and try to have it straightened out. Does it always work? No. Why? Political entropy. No mass energy transfer is ever 100% efficient. So if we look at the US Constitution as a piece of engineering, as an engineering problem to solve, suddenly we can see it as a machine. Machines, what do machines do? What's the basic principle of a machine? Transform energy from one form to another. That's it. That's all that a machine ever does. Who can name the simplest machine? It's not the simplest machine. That's actually third order complexity. Simplest machine. Is that wheel?
I just
Said wheel. There's one simpler. How do you describe a wheel?
A ramp.
What's that?
Ramp.
Thank you. A ramp.
Not the Egyptians.
The inclined plane. Yeah, an inclined plane. What is an inclined plane? I wish I had something I could demonstrate with here. But an inclined plane, you have a top, you've got a bottom, you've got the forces acting on it. You roll the object or slide the object down the inclined plane, or you push it up the inclined plane, and it transforms potential energy into kinetic, or kinetic to potential, depending which direction you're moving the object on the ramp, right? What is a ramp that is that's connected to a movable fulcrum? That's a lever. You turn a lever around in a circle, you got a wheel. So I guess that's actually a second order complex machine rather than a third order. Okay, so that's the Enlightenment. That's the American founding. That's American constitutionalism. I think we can go on to the 20th century now.
Ah, yes, the behavioralism.
Yeah, this is where it starts to get a little bit more technical in the 20th century. In the 1930s, there was a professor of political science at University of Chicago named Charles E. Merriam. He adapted some of the work of people like B.F. Skinner to political phenomena, specifically the phenomena of political behavior. Do we have any psychology folks in here? We got at least one, so you're familiar with Skinner. And so this should look pretty familiar to you, right? This dominated American political science after the Second World War. And it didn't really start to fade. It really didn't start to get systematically engaged and challenged until actually October of 2000. Seriously, October of 2000, I can point to one letter that was anonymously submitted to the editorial staff of the American Political Science Review. It was known as the Perestroika letter. We've talked about it. Ian and I have talked about it. It challenges what had become a dominant orthodoxy in American political science research, that it had to follow the behavioralist track. But we need to take a look at behavioralism. There's a related form, comes from one of Merriam's students, a man named Will Riker. No, not the Will Riker from Star Trek, but William H. Riker as opposed to William T. Riker. Will Riker developed an adaptation of rational choice game theory and focused on the development of formal models of political behavior. I've got an example over here from Harris and Little, the political violence cycle. We got a temperature warning. Speaking of burning up.
That's fine.
But somehow that was appropriate. But yeah, positive political theory was developed in the 50s and 60s by William H. Riker. It applies game theory and mathematics to political science and formalizes rational choice theory. Anybody here familiar with rational choice theory? The idea of rational choice? Here it is in a nutshell. The first premise is that people are rational, people are reasonable. Second is that people perceive the passage of time. They also perceive a self-interest. If you perceive the passage of time, you also know that we don't live forever, right? Yeah, so we perceive our mortality and we have an interest. You put those premises together, the conclusion from rational choice theory is that people act reasonably to maximize their perceived self-interest in the shortest possible time. It is a fundamental tenet of economic theory and also of positive political theory. I think we can move on to the next one. There's Charles Merriam. Again, political behavioralism was developed in the United States in the 1930s. It emphasized quantitative methods of observation, seeks to explain and predict political behavior. It's modeled after Skinner and such, later Piaget. And it claims to explain political behavior in an objective, unbiased manner. Merriam has some conceits that we end up having to impeach. Dominated US political science in the 20th century. And I think we can move on from there. There's Will Riker. Seemed to be a little bit more pleasant. 20 years later, Will Riker emphasizes axioms and formal mathematical reasoning, seeking to describe political phenomena using mathematics, mathematical constructs. It's a synthesis of game theory and social choice theory. And it enables predictive algorithmic modeling of political phenomena. I'm talking to a STEM group here. And so now it's starting to sound more familiar, isn't it? Yeah, let's go on to the next one. Here are the premises of behavioralism, and you might find some resonance here. Research can discover uniformities in human behavior. Just like in biology, research can discover uniformities in life systems, right? These uniformities can be confirmed by empirical tests and measurements. Wow, they're doing science. Quantitative data, he saw as the highest quality and should be analyzed statistically. Have you had stats? Yeah, how many are taking stats now? Anybody? Yeah, okay. So yeah. Political science, he said, should be. Now we've got a problem with this should be, right? Because that's a normative claim. That's a prescriptive claim. Merriam believed that political science should be empirical and predictive. But then here's where we get into the conceit that we have to look at, and I try to keep it at arm's length. Philosophical and historical dimensions of inquiry for Merriam were to be downplayed, discarded, or ignored. There is a school of thought in American political science research today that still believes that political science is the newest of the social sciences, when there is plenty of philosophical and historical evidence that shows, no, in fact, it's the oldest social science, going all the way back to Hecataeus and Kautilya. His goal was this ideal of value-free research, and social scientists should search for a macro theory covering all social science, as opposed to applied issues of practical reform. And I have a couple of illustrations here that show that there's a difference of perspective, like this one. Science, why you exist? Because people like explanations. Philosophy, why you exist? What does philosophy say? Why you exist? Oh, okay, mom and dad forgot about protection. Okay, so we must move on from there. Other principles. Principles of behavior. We got regularity, phenomena are generalized and explained, can be verified. Explanations are verifiable through replicated observation. There's a technique, the use of hypothesis testing and experimentation. And since, according to Merriam, only countable observables exist, data must be numerically expressed wherever possible or practical. This is an example of a data set report. I believe this is related to. This is simply a sample description. This is an end description of a sample data set. So let's move on to the next one. Value neutrality. Yes, one does not simply achieve value neutrality, right? That's what Leo Strauss used to say. So you can't do that because you're going to imbue your own sense of value to whatever you're observing. Ethical assessment has no bearing on empirical explanation as far as the behavioralists are concerned. It's systematized. Consider the importance of theory and research. Well, if that's the case, then why not bring in these other prior forms? Pure science, to defer to pure science is actually a goal, is desirable, and not applied science and research. And of course, the other major principle here is you can integrate social sciences and value. You arrive at value based on facts. You hear the echo of Newton, rational and empirical. Yeah, okay, let's move on from there. Sampling, oh gosh. Yeah, this is an example of somebody doing a document analysis. I have done almost exactly this in some of my own research. Sampling, the emphasis here is on representative samples, greater or lesser reliability. And you got different classes of data, individual, municipal, regional, state, national. Haven't seen a lot of international examples.
Who here has done a literature review?
Lit reviews?
Show of hands, raise them high.
Lit review, yeah. We all had to suffer the lit review. That is actually an empirical test, right? It shows that you're joining the conversation, right? It shows that you are aware of the research in the field. And you either accept, or you question, or you reject, or you challenge, or you reinforce, right? You do all of those with a lit review. And oh no, I've lost you. So I lost the psychologist.
We've got one double major in the
Oh,
chat.
cool. Okay. So I'm not completely lost. Thank you for coming. We have interviews, scoring and scaling. One has to develop scales of measurement to observe behavior. Of course, he's only looking at behavior. And this involves a statistical analysis of data sets, either univariate, bivariate, multivariate. If you were itching for STEM principles, here they are. All this statistical modeling and testing, analysis of variance, ANOVA, ANCOVA, gamma tests, one-tailed, two-tailed tests. God, what else? A chi-square, anyone? You have just, the reaction on your face told me you have just done a chi-square analysis, right? Like what, last week? Not that long. Not that recently, okay. Okay. But they're focusing on data sets, right? So let's move on to the next one.
That was last semester, wasn't it?
Was it last semester? Okay.
It was the spring, yeah.
The spring, okay.
It still haunts them.
It still haunts them, yes. I had to do a chi-square, gosh, 30, yeah, now you can point at me and laugh and go, you're old. But some 30 odd years ago, I had to do a chi-square analysis for significance testing. And I'm kind of glad that I learned how to do it, because when I started teaching, I found that when my dean asked me to test whether there was any significant difference in how a course was taught versus how it was an experiment. He asked for significance, and I went, Significance, oh no. Any significant difference? You want me to do this? You want me to do a chi-square, don't you? He didn't know that's what he was asking for, but by God, that's what I gave him. He was duly impressed. Okay, theoretical claims must be supported by empirical observation. Theories and hypotheses which contradict observable phenomena, according to Merriam and the behavioralists and all the rest of them, have to be discarded as false. Political research may take advantage of technological advances in refinement, especially data mining and big data analysis and trends and such. I have a former student of mine, a colleague, who ported a model that I was working on into a big data engrammatic analytic tool, specifically GNU-R. Yeah, so it was impressive. Turned out to be the bedrock of his bachelor's thesis, his bachelor's research. Okay, so I think there's the yeah, we need to look at the limits of behavioralism. Traditional areas of political science are often beyond the reach of behavioral inquiry because there's more to political science than behavior. Some political concepts resist quantification. I think I found a way to do some of it. Especially fundamental concepts like democracy, liberty, equality, sovereignty. I tend to think of these, especially liberty and equality, as having an irreducible complexity. Once you find that irreducible complexity, then you know this is what we need to verify, what we need to measure empirically. Quantitative research is limited often to trivial political behavior, and value neutrality, value neutral research can actually produce some ethically questionable practices.
I know some of them have to leave shortly for the next class.
Oh, you got another class. It's at 1, right?
Yeah, we gotta go to class, well, listen to that.
Yeah, well, we're recording this, aren't we?
Yes.
Okay. So you can see this later. All right, so I want to go ahead and conclude with a personal example. See, we got to the personal example, now you gotta leave. Oh well. So, okay, I got a query back in 2003. It was my first semester teaching full-time. The colleague was actually somebody I went to my undergraduate coursework with. His name was Russell Mitchell. He was an historian, and he was also he was a medieval military historian. And the way that medieval military historians go, they have this tendency to like to play politics. There was a listserv. Does anybody use listservs anymore? You do. You still use listserv. It's kind of like an early form of social media. And it was called the Armor Archive, and they got into this sidebar discussion about the difference between communism and fascism. Now, he was an historian, and so he only could recognize communism and fascism from their effects. Turns out that they have almost exactly the same effects, namely widespread misery and high body counts. That's the one thing that they have in common. An historian is going to look to that first. Anarchism does the same thing. I'm looking at you, Rwanda, in 1994. So he asked me this question because I've got a degree in politics, right? He says, hey, I got an ace in the hole. He says, what's the difference between a communist and a fascist? This resulted in this lengthy document analysis of communist, fascist, and also anarchist literature and authors. Looked at I decided to embark on a kind of empirical observation of recurrent patterns in language, diction, coming from known ideologues. I had to read some pretty objectionable material. I had to read Mussolini's Political and Social Doctrine of Fascism. I had to read Mao's Little Red Book. I had to read, who was the anarchist? Leo Tolstoy was one of the anarchists. There are a couple of other anarchists, J.P. Barlow. Actually, he was a moderate libertarian, never mind. But this led to an hypothesis about preference on three variables, a refinement of dictionary files. You could either do this through a bag of words approach, which is that's dictionary files, or you could use the engram approach, which is what Daniel Berkbichler did. So here are these three irreducibly complex concepts: liberty, equality, and order. They're widely held political principles. And they are, and depending on their proportion, you can, regardless of expressed ideology, you're going to see these three usually in some combination. And the hypothesis here, and the model that develops, was that a proportional attachment to or rejection of these three principles indicates one's ideological preference. So one of the ways that you can do this is the old bag of words approach, count key indicator words. Suddenly, if you're counting, that's quantitative. You're looking at the text. What does the text say? Look at the words, phrases, engrams on each variable. Attachment to would be a positive ideological orientation. Rejection would be a negative ideological orientation or preference. And you can describe this in a space, a kind of map with at least three axes. If liberty, equality, and order are irreducibly complex, they are therefore observable independent variables, right? Here we have a space: liberty, equality, and order. I called it Leo for a number of years. And so if we move from there, we'll take a look at what happens. This is what it looks like, sort of, when you formalize it.
Oh, I remember this.
Remember this?
It was so simple back then.
It was, wasn't it? Those were the days. Don't let that dx confuse you. That is not a derivative. That's an ordered pair. I tried to do the subscripts, but I'm using PowerPoint. And if you've ever tried to use the symbol widget in PowerPoint, you know it's unstable.
Just don't.
Yeah, you end up getting something that looks this bad. So, I mean, I've got a bracket here with a closed paren. No, I tried fixing it again this morning, saved it, opened it back up again. No, it's back to where it was, all screwed up. This dx was supposed to be a subscript, d sub x. It's an ordered pair. I mean, how many do calculus? Yeah, of course. You know ordered pairs. It's Calc 1, isn't it? Yeah. So here we have I sub rho maps to a sum of three squares. The inequality describing the area under that sum of three squares. You recognize that, right? I'm looking at all the analytic geometry people in here. Sum of three squares, what is it? If it's just the limit, if it's just the edge, that's a sphere. It's also topologically identical to a space. If you are describing the space underneath that, inside that sphere, now you've got an integral, right? This is a formal model of ideological preference using words and phrases or engrams as the observable data. So we got three axial principles: liberty, equality, order. I feel like I need to turn the lights off. And there are 6 levels, it turns out, different thresholds. You can use this same model to describe a centrist, a moderate, an ideologue, a hardliner, a radical, or an extremist. Wow, that's hard to see. Is that going to show up?
It's got the video on.
The video is on.
So yeah.
Okay,
I
it
was
will
like,
show.
hit the light there.
Yeah, let me hit this light. Which one?
Top one.
Top one, on, off. Everything's off now. There it
There
is.
it is.
There we got a sphere. There's our sphere. Okay, so there's also a way to analyze this in terms of what are called octants. When you're dealing with three-dimensional geometry, before we actually get there, and look at the different degrees of distance from that absolute center. We've got our libertarians, our egalitarians, our establishmentarians, and also the common names that we typically hear about what those preferences indicate. If the highest score is in liberty, you've got a libertarian. If the highest score is in equality, you've got an egalitarian. If it's in order, you have an establishmentarian. We've got libertarian centrists, the fair centrist, the state centrist, moderate libertarians, moderate quote unquote left, moderate right. Because of this research, because of this working out of this model and trying to formalize it, I can no longer talk about, ooh, left wing, right wing, at least not really, because that's simply a chord. It's an oversimplification of the political world and political preferences. So let's take a look at these octants, and this is just in one space. There we go. We got pro-liberty, pro-equality, pro-order. That's your standard preference. The anti-libertarians, that it would be a second octant. An anti-egalitarian would be a third one. The anti-libertarian and anti-egalitarian is our fourth octant. Anti-establishmentarian would be the fifth octant. Now you might be wondering, can you find examples of these in the wild? Absolutely you can. Anti-establishmentarian here, it's Michael Moore. You familiar with Michael Moore? Roger and Me, a TV Nation, Fahrenheit 9/11. Yeah, he's an anti-establishmentarian. I know, I've measured him. I've measured some of his rhetoric. How about Ann Coulter? She's simply an anti-egalitarian. She's not really a conservative. What else do we have? Anti-libertarian and anti-establishmentarian. These are kind of like your anarcho-communists, sort of. Because, however, they're also anti-liberty. Universal opposition. This is called a know-nothing. And the know-nothing, this was an ideology that developed, at least in the United States, in the mid-1850s, about 1854 to 1856, when the Whig Party disintegrated, right, on the eve of the US Civil War. This universal opposition, I have also found some contemporary examples. How many of you are familiar with Mark Levin? You're familiar with Mark Levin? He's in this octant. He's actually in this octant. He detests liberty, detests equality, detests order. He tends to be opposed. He describes himself as opposed to all of those things that you see that you see in the mainstream political parties. Have you read The Democrat Party Hates America? Yeah, he's a know-nothing.
He has a show called Life, Liberty.
Oh, Life, Liberty, and Levin. Yeah. He will throw up liberty and then turn right around and contradict himself. Have you noticed that? Yeah. He's very much in the universal opposition camp. So yeah, you can find these in the wild. They do exist. There is pro-equality, pro-order, and anti-libertarian. I can think of two public figures from the last 20 years who embodied more or less that principle or that octant. John McCain and John Kerry. This is independent of partisanship. This has nothing to do with political partisanship. Okay, let's move on to something else. There's more going on here. Most ideological preferences are found only in the first octant. Coulter and Levin need to watch themselves, but Levin does it for the sake of selling books and getting an audience so that he can be on the forefront of what's known as uncivil discourse. And hey, if you're going to go with universal opposition, that's a pretty surefire way of doing it, right?
Make sure you agree with no one.
Make sure you agree with no one. Exactly. There are other variables, though. Will, action, self, other. You got will to achieve versus will to resist. You've got action, positive action, which would be like helping someone, or negative action, harming someone. Self, pro-self, anti-self. Yes, there are anti-self political preferences out there. Then there's your other, pro-other, anti-other. You add will, watch what happens. One independent variable produces a line, 2 produces a plane, 3 produces a space, 4 produces that. That's a hypersphere that's being turned on the 4th independent variable. What appears to be all those little wedges that are changing shape, they're not actually changing shape. You're just rotating the object in a 4D hyperspace. So what happens when you add will? You end up with something like this. You've got an ideology space, you've got a welfare space, you have a community space, and you have a power space. That's just adding one independent variable. Suddenly it's an order of magnitude more complex. Now it's a sum of 4 squares. We advance to the, we do this comparison of that hypersphere, and you can see where those triangles are mapping to this enmeshed set of 4 spheres, right? That's an informal expression of what Yeah, you can it is possible to formalize this, otherwise we wouldn't be able to get the animation working. Okay, so let's move on from there. Yeah, there's that hypersphere. And that's just one additional variable. That's just one. You get ideology, welfare, community, and power. We move on from there, what do we get? What about behavior? I mean, we looked at 20th century American political science was all about behavior. What is behavior? In this model, it involves action, by a self or on a self, by an other or on an other. Positive or negative action may favor or oppose, that's self or other. So this is action, self, and other. One of the things that I ended up discovering when building this model, when working within it, when trying to find empirical verification as I'm developing the root hypothesis, was that I could actually finally explain why the two different sides of what's called the Chicago School, Charles Merriam on one side, Leo Strauss on the other, why they generally ignored each other and are completely, and you got this normative and maybe even prescriptive view of political thought on one side that is completely, wholly ignorant and even suspicious of the behavioral side. It's because they're not looking at the same thing. They're not looking at the same variables. They're two totally different subfields of political science. So we have this preference behavior, plus or minus, action, self, and other. You put all of this together, that implies another three-dimensional space. I had to figure out, okay, how many of these are there? Since we've got 7 independent variables, anybody know the combination formula? You know the combination formula? You had to mess around with factorials? Yeah, there it is. 35 three-dimensional spaces to work with. 35 four-dimensional hyperspaces to deal with too. So we've got I sub s maps to a sum of 3 squares, which is a subset of a sum of 4 squares, all proportional to 1, where I sub n is an element of that set, LEO, WHS, and X, liberty, equality, order, will, action, self, other. And then we have S, which is the which space they're in is part of another set. There's 35 to combine to get have to describe. I don't know if I included all of that, but there's 35 of these. There's the curve, right? The number of independent variables. When you add more independent variables, it gets hairy. It gets to a level of complexity that is going to require big data analysis. It's going to require mathematical tools like I used Mathematica. I used Wolfram Mathematica, but of course I also threw it into PowerPoint too. So there's some limited stats tools in PowerPoint. I don't necessarily have a lot of time to go find a better tool. And SPSS, sorry, doesn't do it. Won't let you do it because SPSS really is biased towards one independent variable, one dependent variable. That's like looking at the universe through a soda straw. So you'll notice that I called this the monster with good reason. The more I looked into it, the more I realized this is enormous. This has nested infinities, at least when you're looking at infinite densities proportional to 1. So we got liberty, equality, order, will, action, self, and other. What else do we have?
Applying it.
Here's an application. How many of you are familiar with the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 document?
I haven't read it.
You haven't read it? Yeah, it's 900 pages. So it's a 900-page document. And so I figured that this was an ideal case study, an ideal example that I could present to you today. This is using this method. This is an analysis of the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 Mandate for Leadership document. All 35 of these three-dimensional spaces have names. I've actually given them names, ascribed names to them based on what is the closest approximation in politics. Notice the highest frequency distributions. I broke it down into 37 bins based on the subject matter, from taking the reins in the White House office, to the cabinet department, to the economy, to independent regulatory agencies. Look for the highest frequency distributions. I mean, you've done dispersions, basic, it's basic univariate statistics, right? Well, you can do a dispersion in 7 independent variables too, because you're doing it all at once. And that's what I've done here with 37 different sections. So 37 bins using those 7 variables. And I've broken them out here as a kind of histogram. I've also put it here as a, not a time series, but a content series as you go through the document. What do we see? The highest frequency, order, action, and other. Project 2025 document from the Heritage Foundation, based on this analysis, primarily operates in what's called the intervention space. Those who embrace the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 document believe that they are conducting an intervention on American society based on what I have measured just from counting words, just from counting these words from a dictionary file. And I did it kind of I used a kind of kludgy approach. I broke everything down into a Word document, into each of these bins, and then Control F based on the dictionary file, and also partial and grammatic approach. So what do we see? The Department of Defense is all about will, action, and self, which is kind of understandable. You've got Department of Health and Human Services. Oh my gosh, look at how many high scores there are. Liberty, equality, and order, as well as action and other. Liberty, equality, and order is where you find ideology. That's where you find liberals, conservatives, labor, anarchists, communists, fascists, communitarians, and such. The welfare liberalism. They're all found in Leo. They're found in liberty, equality, and order in different proportion. But what we see, so that's going to be important too. But what really stands out is action, order, and other. It's other directed. Any questions? Actually, I think there's something. Is there something else in there?
That was the end of that. I did have the QR code for the students.
Okay.
The feedback form, which for everyone who's still here and for those who've left, I will send it out. But
okay. I had another slide that I added to it that broke it down in intervention as well as ideology, but because that also was revealing. But apparently it wasn't on that version. Anyway, questions, comments, complaints? Yes.
So political science question. So you showed the trend that it's obvious trend that the number of the voter turnout is less in the midterm elections.
Yes.
But we also see that generally the party that wins the White House, the midterm doesn't really align with that.
No, it doesn't.
And I wonder what
No, not at all.
why is that?
That is a different hypothesis. That's based on that's actually a completely appropriate behavioralist question, and the best explanation that I've heard so far actually comes from, it's not Joseph Nye, it's not Cohen, it might be Sidney Verba, about how, oh wait, no, it's Will Riker, about how the salience of issues during a midterm election are fundamentally different from those of a general electoral college election. I don't call it the presidential election, because I don't know if you're aware of this or not. We don't have a president-elect yet, because the electoral college has not met to cast their ballots. That doesn't happen until mid-December. We don't know who the actual president-elect is until January 6th. And then he's got 2 weeks to get to DC. But yeah, a lot of that has to do with there's also some hypotheses about political memory. The political memory of the voter, at least according to, I think Harris and Little's, some of their research, as well as not nine, I keep wanting to say nine, I know it's not nine. Again, Riker, is that the political memory of most American voters does not extend more than about 13, 14 months. And so once you have something that's more than 13, 14 months away, it has no bearing on the next round. So what you're looking at there with midterm elections and the general election that leads to the presidency it's almost like looking at it is looking at two different behavioral events. So yeah, that would be why.
Thank you.
Sure. Yes.
When you said that the Department of Health and Human Services had high numbers,
Yes.
is that including like any sort of standardization for pages spent on a specific topic? Like when you divide the
That I
topic?
did not. I would have to normalize it
Yeah.
so that an average comes out. I would, at this point, I'd only have the opportunity or time to approach it as raw data, and I cut it two different ways. One of them was by department, which is the one that I presented today. The other was by uniform segments, which had unrelated content in each bin. And that's not necessarily helpful. It would actually be a way of refining this, absolutely, would be to normalize those following proportional analysis. And of course, when you do that, you'd have to do that. I would have to do that by breaking it up into each of the 35 spaces. So I have done that for ideology and intervention. That was that last slide that I wanted to show everybody. Thought it was on the version that I sent to Ian, but it's not. It is on my thumb drive. I don't know. You want to plug that one in?
Don't know if we've got time for that today,
Okay.
but I can
That's
definitely
fine.
send that as a follow-up.
Okay.
But yeah, if you have any questions in the chat, please let us know so we can address them. But thank you so much, Professor York, for coming out today.
I hope it fit the bill.
Oh, I think it does. I'm a little biased. I remember I was a student of his when this was first coming out. My tiny bit of contribution to this was that will axis there, that will towards or will against something was my
That's
tiny
yours.
little contribution to this research
Absolutely.
way back in the day. But yeah, it was based on observation because I was looking at civil rights, and I was specifically looking at immigration policy relative to civil rights. And there's a desire for something, and there is a desire to resist something. And the language people use when they're enacting that policy was different. And I asked the question, why?
Mhm.
How did that fit into
This
this
model.
mathematical normalization of those functions? Because it was
Formalization.
because it was independent of either of those three axes
Mhm.
at the time, because you could be for something or against something and be using the same language. And so my question was, what axis is that? And that's where will came from,
Will
and then
came
that opened up the second Pandora's box inside the nesting egg of.
Oh, yeah, it is quite the little matryoshka. So.
But thank you so much, everybody. It was an awesome lecture. Thank you from the
Quite welcome.
comments.
I want to try to go ahead and normalize those curves. One reason why I didn't, part of it was because of time. But another part of it was because I wanted to see how much attention is focused on each one of these departments or each one of these themes. And it's pretty clear that the highest score of everything, Health and Human Services. Health and Human Services and international trade. One thing that I can say about this document is that if this is in fact the blueprint for the incoming executive administration, The area that we really need to pay the closest attention to is gonna be the Department of Health and Human Services and international trade. And doesn't that track with the threat of 20% tariffs across the board? International trade. And then with the Department of Health and Human Services repealing the Affordable Care Act. Of course, the Affordable Care Act has nothing to do with healthcare, has to do with insurance premium financing. But still, it is thematically related to HHS.
You heard Trump has created the Department of Government.
Government efficiency, you put Elon Musk in charge of it, yeah.
Oh, and the other dude, so two people in charge of the.
Oh, Vivek
Department of-
Ramaswamy?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah.
I
yeah,
love
so
our government efficiency. Thank
Yeah.
you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much for coming. Surprised that you stayed till the end.